Hello, welcome back. I'm the Grouchy Historian. Continuing on with our AP World History preparation series, we come to the critical years of 1450 to 1750. Again, this is not meant to be a totally comprehensive review, but an overview, hopefully to direct your study as you prepare for the exam. Again, highly recommend that you get a study guide to do the practice exams. Yes, I'm going to say that every video because it's that important. Okay, mandatory quote, which you have to have at the beginning of every slide. All right, now we get to, as it were, kind of where the rubber meets the road here in world history. This time period is of course marked by the rise of Europe as the dominant world power. The focus here, as you go through the text, is going to be how other cultures interacted with Europe. Changes to the global economy and trade, we're going to find that these accelerate greatly during this period for a number of reasons. Changes to the global environment as well. Within Europe, two of the biggest impacts on culture, society, economics, religion, pretty much everything during this time, is the Renaissance and Reformation. In fact, a lot of historians have considered this entire time period up until the first part, probably really of the 18th century, as the era of the Renaissance and Reformation. You have a tremendous surge of art and technology, technology in Europe at the time. And these technologies, in particular, the invention of the printing press will have a marked effect on pretty much all aspects of European life and culture. So let's get started. So again, two of the overarching themes here are the scientific evolution, and of course these are some of the most significant scientific minds of the age. I think we kind of take for granted some of their theories because they're of course eminently obvious to us in the 21st century, but at the time they were pretty radical. All of humanity at the time had considered that well, because there were people, hey, the universe revolved around us, right? It revolved around, everything in the universe revolved around the sun. Now, and the mathematical proof of this upset a few people. So the Copernican and Galilean and even the Tycho revolution in astronomy and in what would become the field of astrophysics are really remarkable. And of course, there's the contribution of Johannes Kepler. The scientific and mathematical formulas that these guys were able to figure out with, basically pencil, paper, and their brain is just really remarkable. And of course, let's not forget our man, Sir Isaac Newton, and his 3 laws of motion. Newtonian physics, as he developed it, would pretty much dominate for almost 200 years until they were replaced by Einstein's theory of relativity, and then succeeded finally in the late 20th century by the scientific theories and proofs of Stephen Hawking. And of course, most importantly during this time was the development of the scientific method. There was the theory that all of creation, as it were, could be discovered through reason and logic, and that you could make a scientific theory, test it against observation to either prove or disprove your theory based on the facts that you saw with your hypothesis. This is where you come up with the idea of making a hypothesis, setting up a way to test your hypothesis, and seeing if it's true. The entire scientific method developed during this period was pretty much used until the early 21st century, when sometimes we don't really care about the scientific method, we just want the politically correct answer, but that's another topic of conversation. Of course, along with scientific revolution, there's also a sort of political and philosophical revolution known as the Enlightenment. Here you will see some of the great original thoughts on the relationship of men and governments, some of the early science of economics brought forth by Adam Smith. And you can definitely see a almost linear straight line follow-up from political philosophers such as Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu to ultimately the American Revolution, with the idea that was, again, pretty radical at the time that there might not be such a thing as the divine right of kings to rule. And of course, all of this was punctuated by the European era of exploration and expansion. Remember, earlier than this, the Chinese had actually developed one of the world's first great navies and had explored all the way down the South Indian continent, all the way down the east coast of Africa, and it actually made their way into the Atlantic, probably could have discovered the New World, except the Chinese dynasty that succeeded the great ocean-going dynasty basically burned their fleet at the waterline, turned insular, and gave up all the advancements that the Chinese had made in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, gave it all up, gave it away. And the Europeans were able to take over the exploration of the New World. Now, of course, some of this, all of this was based on the ability to have new ship and navigation procedures and technologies, primarily sextants. There's a really great book written that title escapes me at the moment, that the ability to determine longitude. All navigation in the world is done by a series of latitude and longitude, right? If you ever have a genuine GPS receiver, not the super cool map that you get on your iPhone, but the old-fashioned GPS receivers, they gave you a latitude and a longitude, and that's how everything in the world is basically mapped. Latitude was something that the Europeans knew how to determine early on. Longitude was a lot tougher because you not only had to have a sextant and the ability to use what are called site reduction tables to use stellar navigation to determine your position, but you also needed a very precise chronometer to help you determine your longitude. So once the Europeans were able to determine latitude and longitude and develop new techniques of navigation, boom, off they went to explore the new worlds. And of course, all of this was also driven by the advancements in mathematics and other sciences from Newton and others. They also, of course, built larger ships that were able to carry more cargo and had greater endurance. They had better shipbuilding technologies and techniques. All of this is in the book to make yourself familiar with. Of course, Columbus discovered, well, I use the word discovered. Yes, a lot of people don't like that word because, of course, New World was there all the time. However, it was charted and noted by Columbus as he was actually sailing to the west, trying to get to India, as I mentioned in the last video, to bypass the need to go through Islamic or Mongol-controlled territory to get to the very lucrative spice trade of the Indian subcontinent. When he initially landed in the New World, he thought he was in India. So the legend goes, that's where the word Indians came from, because Columbus thought those were the people that lived on the continent of India. So we have, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on another slide, we have the beginning of the exploration of the New World. Of course, some of the more noticeable, less than optimal occurrences were the transmission of diseases, right? The Europeans had undergone a great number of plagues in the centuries before this time period, and those survivors had developed some natural immunities for diseases. Of course, the native tribes in the New World had none of these natural immunities, and depending upon whose numbers you want to use, there was a tremendous, basically extinction event of many of the tribes that lived in the New World after contact with the Europeans. There was also the Encomienda system, which was very repressive toward the native tribes. There was the growth of the slave trade, first in Spanish-controlled territories, but eventually in the English colonies as well. But there was also the Columbian Exchange, and this is a term that they discuss quite a bit. So this is the exchange of agricultural products, right? The potato, other vegetables that came from the old world to the new, the introduction of horses to the new world from the old world. And all of this was made possible, the early colonization, particularly in the English colonies, was made possible by a commercial revolution, including the growth of the joint stock company, capitalism, that allowed businessmen that wanted to fund expeditions to the New World to not have to bear all the expense of it themselves. They could join together with other like-minded businessmen in these joint stock companies. Therefore, you didn't have to put all your fortune on the line, just some of it. Of course, the biggest, I think, invention of this era, if you ask me, of course, is the printing press. Now you had the ability to basically spread knowledge. You could almost call the printing press the internet of this era, because it put things such as the Bible in the hands of the common people, because they were now, we'll just say, less expensive to produce, and they were now able to be, instead of having them only in churches or cathedrals, now initially the very wealthy could have them in their house as well. Gunpowder as well, again, another invention brought from East Asia, from trade, allowed European military superiority, which gave them a great advantage when encountering native tribes. We see this in the Spanish conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas. Again, I mentioned ship technology that allowed larger and larger ships to carry larger and larger quantities of goods back and forth between the New World and the Old World, again, increasing commerce and trade and binding these colonies together with their mother country. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And of course, we also see some changes in the role of women. Not a lot, but some changes as we see the rise of a merchant class in this era. Not quite, I think, what you would call a full middle class, but certainly you see great wealth accumulating in people that do not have noble birth, do not have title, do not have lineage. They just have a lot of business sense. Of course, this era in particular was noted by European rivalries, primarily over the colonies and the wealth that they all thought they could get from colonies, but there was still power politics going on in Europe. You will see a notable number of wars in this era, including the 30 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession. Everybody was figuring out who was going to succeed who on the throne to try to maintain what they like to call the balance of power in Europe between the different royal houses, as it were. So some of the great early rivals were, of course, Spain and Portugal for dominance of the New World. You will see the rise of both England and France in this era and their competition both in Europe and globally as they both compete for colonial and imperial power. Germany, or as it's known in this era, is the Holy Roman Empire, which one wag at the period wrote was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But this was a scattering of principalities and small states who basically had a common culture and a common language, but not much else, that dominated Middle Europe. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 left most of that area devastated for a very long time. And until you see the rise of Prussia and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, most of Germany were just soccer balls to be kicked around by the other European powers. Of course, you do see the rise of Russia at this time, and Russia's dominance or growing dominance of the Baltic region and its expansion into what would soon become the modern state of Russia, and also moving down into the Caucasus areas, where we will see in the next century, in the 1800s, the rivalry between Britain and Russia for the area north of India that's modern day Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course, we cannot forget the Ottoman Empire. This is sort of the last gasp of greatness for the Ottoman Empire. Of course, during this period, they conquer the remains of the Byzantine Empire with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. They conquer most of Southern Europe, what is now the Balkans, Greece, what would become Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, all the way up to the gates of Vienna, with the final turning back of the Ottoman Empire from threatening to dominate Europe not occurring until the final siege of Vienna in 1683. Now, of course, in Africa, you still have the great empires there as well that are, in their own way, commercial and economic powerhouses. They begin their interaction with Europe, primarily on the coastal areas of Africa, where they also participate in the slave trade. We see the great Ming dynasties. Again, as I mentioned in earlier, the great Chinese seafarer Zhang He had a armada that would have dwarfed anything in Europe about a century before Europe even thought about having an armada. But again, the Chinese turned back right when they were, I think, on the cusp of discovering the New World. There's even some historians that ponder if the Chinese might have discovered the New World on the West Coast, coming down the coast of Canada into the coast of North America in the upper Northwest. But all of that was done when the Manchu dynasty literally burned the fleet at the waterline and turned back China's time as a seafaring nation. In Japan, we see the rise of the shoguns and the Edo period. Again, Japan is very insular at this period, fights a number of wars with China, but for the most part, shuts itself off from trade with the European powers as they start to move up the coast of China. A lot of terms and conditions here. I put a bunch. I know I haven't gotten them all. That's why I said you need to look at all the Enlightenment writers, thinkers, and philosophers. You need to look at Martin Luther, some of the other key players of the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation from the Catholic Church, the numerous wars that occurred during this period, most of them dynastic wars for who is going to rule various empires in Europe. And of course, I don't think we can totally overestimate the importance of innovations of this period, particularly the printing press for the spread of knowledge, and not just philosophical knowledge or religious knowledge, but practical knowledge. This is when you had the first maps, became extremely popular, charts. This was part of that whole revolution in navigation, the ability to mass produce, for the time, maps and charts, gunpowder. Again, this not only was personal hand weapons, but it was also the great cannons that would equip the great warships of Europe to outrival anything else in the world. So all of these terms are important. There's probably a lot more. I didn't put a lot of people on here. Again, I leave that as an exercise here. If somebody is mentioned, probably should take note of it. So this concludes the era from 1450 to 1750. Again, this is the era of European dominance. This is when Europe starts to, we'll say, overtake the rest of the world in terms of military power, economic power, political influence, and the beginning of the race to set up colonies, establish great global empires to increase trade and political power. We will continue that discussion in the next session. Thank you very much for watching.